The decree was 9 pages long. I know because I read it. Not on the day it was filed. I didn't know anything about it on the day it was filed. I was deep in the port thrust manifold of the ECV Resolute margin, 300 meters below the main deck, running torque calibrations on the secondary drive coupling with grease on my forearms and a headlamp strapped to my brow. And the most urgent thing in my universe was a microfracture in coupling mount 4 that was singing at a frequency I didn't like. I was 41 years old. I had been a propulsion engineer in the Earth Consolidated Fleet for 19 years. I knew the sound of a part that was about to fail, and coupling mount 4 was about to fail, and I was fixing it. So no, I didn't read the decree that day. I read it 22 days later, in the operations briefing room of Admiralty Station Crest, sitting in a cold metal chair at a long table with 11 other senior engineers, while a fleet admiral named Corvin Moss stood at the end of the room with his hands behind his back, and his face arranged into something so still and controlled that it had stopped looking like a face and started looking like a judgment. He said, "What you are about to read has been verified by 4 independent diplomatic channels, 2 signals intelligence stations, and direct testimony from 14 civilian administrators recovered from the affected colonies. There is no dispute about the facts. There is no clerical error. There is no mistranslation." He set a data folio on the table and slid it down. It stopped in front of me. I opened it. 9 pages. Surath Directorate administrative letterhead on every page, their seal at the top, a hexagonal grid pattern in pale gold, the kind of thing you put on a document when you want the document to feel inevitable. The kind of letterhead that says, "This was not a decision, this was a procedure." The kind that says, "We did not choose to do this. The law required it. The law is not us. The law is simply the law." The decree was titled, in Surath Common, something that translated roughly as Clarification of Biological Unit Status, Non-Registered Settlements, Outer Reaches, Cycle 7 of the current administrative period. That was the title, clarification, as if what it was doing was simply tidying up a misunderstanding. What it was doing was this. Across 14 human colony worlds in the outer settlement band, worlds that humanity had reached and built and bled for over the course of 60 years, worlds where people had grown up and buried their parents and named their children and planted gardens. The Surath Directorate had determined that the human settlers did not possess legal personhood under Directorate law. They had never registered. They had simply arrived, unannounced, in space that the Directorate considered within its administrative sphere, and they had built things and lived there, and that was all well and good, but it did not make them legal persons. It made them biological units occupying Directorate-adjacent territory without classification. And the decree was the classification. 2.3 million people, named on appendices that the folio did not include in full. There were too many names for the folio. The appendices ran to approximately 6,000 additional pages, which were available upon request from Directorate Administrative Records, Surath Prime, processing time 14 to 21 standard days. 2.3 million people stripped of legal personhood, reclassified as unregistered biological units under Article 7. Subsection 12 of the Directorate's Outer Reaches Administration Code, and reassigned to the labor integration track, which the decree described as a pathway toward eventual registered status pending satisfactory service completion and behavioral assessment over a period not to exceed 40 years. 40 years. There was a word for what that was, and it was not labor integration. The word for what that was is a short word in every human language, 4 or 5 letters, something that sits in the back of the throat like a stone. I will not write it here because the Surath Directorate spent 9 pages avoiding it, and I refuse to give them the dignity of a debate about vocabulary. What it was is what it was. 2.3 million human beings reclassified as property, with paperwork, filed in triplicate, stamped with a gold hexagonal seal. Admiral Moss gave us about 4 minutes to read. Then he said, "This decree was filed 18 days ago. The labor integration process has already begun on 3 of the 14 worlds. Our people are being moved." Nobody said anything. He said, "The ardent reckoning departs in 4 days. 418,000 warships, every available hull we can crew and fuel. We are not sending a diplomatic note. We are not requesting a suspension of the decree. We are not asking for a clarification of the clarification." He paused, not for effect, not to let the drama settle. He paused because he was reading something in his head that he had been reading for 18 days, and he was still not done with it. He said, "We are going to Surath Prime. And when we arrive, the Surath Directorate is going to learn what happens when you file paperwork on 2.3 million human beings." That was all he said. He picked up the folio, tucked it under his arm, and walked out. I sat for a moment longer. I looked at the space where the folio had been. I thought about coupling Mount 4, which I had fixed, which was no longer singing at a bad frequency, which was now solid and true. I thought about what it means to fix a thing that was broken. I thought about what it means when the thing that is broken is not a coupling mount but a category, when someone has decided with 9 pages of paperwork that a human being is not a human being. I stood up. I went back to my ship. I had a lot of work to do before departure. The Resolute Margin was a heavy support cruiser, not a warship, or not primarily a warship. She was rated combat capable, which in the fleet meant she carried defensive arrays and a respectable forward battery, but her primary function was engineering support, propulsion analysis, hull repair, systems redundancy management for the larger dreadnoughts she traveled beside. She was 14 years old and she felt older. I had been aboard her for 6 of those years, and in that time I had learned every sound she made, every vibration, every idiosyncrasy of her recycled air system and her water reclamation loop, and the particular groan her port ventral stabilizer produced in high-G maneuvers that had never been anything serious, and yet had never entirely gone away despite 3 separate attempts to fix it. I loved her the way you love a tool that has never failed you, quietly, without sentiment, with the specific knowledge of what she could and could not do. In the 4 days before departure, I did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch. Neither did anyone else. The dry docks at Crest Station were a continuous roar of machinery, the kind of sound that stops registering as separate noises and becomes a single sustained note, the whole station humming like something alive and angry. Fuel lines run, munitions loaded. Hull patches applied to ships that had been scheduled for longer repairs, but were being pressed into service anyway because we needed them. Because 418,000 was what we had, and we were taking all of it. My crew ran 31 pre-departure diagnostics. We found 9 things that needed immediate attention and addressed all 9. We found 4 things that needed monitoring and flagged them for continuous observation. We found 2 things that were probably fine but that I didn't like, and I assigned Petty Officer Quema J to those 2 things specifically, because a J had the instincts I had once had when I was younger and less tired, the instincts that hear what is not quite right yet before it becomes wrong. On the night before departure, night being a conventional designation on a station that cycled its lights but had no sun, I sat in the engineering bay with a cup of bad coffee and the deployment manifest on a data tablet, and I read the names of the 14 worlds. Harrow Station, Combs World, New Meridian Reach, Dusthaven. Taraco Settlement. The Bren Archipelago, that one was not a planet but a system of 17 inhabited moons, each one named for something from a human language, Beach and Ember and Caro and the rest. Pale Crossing. Vellum's End. The Orvian settlements, which was technically 6 separate colony clusters grouped under one administrative designation. Sergeant's Landing. Fort Eldon. The Yun Cooperative, which was a collective of self-governing fishing communities on an ocean world that had taken 40 years to terraform and had been home to people for the last 20. I had not been to any of them. I knew people who had. Ajay had a cousin in the Bren archipelago, on Ember specifically, a settlement of about 12,000 people who harvested mineral deposits from the moon's shallow seas and shipped them inward. His cousin's name was Ya. She had 2 daughters. He had not heard from her since the decree. That was the only time I saw Ajay not moving. He was standing at his duty station, very still, holding a wrench he had forgotten he was holding, staring at the bulkhead. I did not say anything to him. There was nothing to say. I went back to my manifest. We departed at 600 station time, 418,000 ships, in a formation so large that it took 11 hours for the last elements to clear the Crest Station transit corridor. I was not watching the formation from outside. I was in the engineering bay, monitoring our own systems, which was where I was going to be for most of this. But I had been at Crest Station during departures before, smaller ones, routine ones, the ordinary rhythm of a fleet that spends most of its time moving, and I knew what 418,000 ships looked like from the observation deck. It looks like a decision. Not a threat, not a gesture, a decision. There is a quality to that much mass moving in one direction with that much purpose that is different in kind from anything else I have seen. It is not impressive in the way that an explosion is impressive, sudden and violent and consuming itself. It is impressive the way a wall is impressive. The way you understand, looking at a wall, that it was not built yesterday and it will not come down tomorrow, and it knows exactly what it is and what it is for. That was the ardent reckoning. 418,000 ships, and behind every hull a crew that had read the decree or heard it read, or had it explained to them by a commander who had read it, and who had then spent 4 days loading and calibrating and checking and rechecking, while the thing the decree said settled into them the way cold settles into a stone, not sudden, not dramatic, but thorough all the way through, until the stone is cold at its center and stays cold. We transited in waves. The transit itself, the fold, the passage, the arrival, is the part of deep space operations that engineers talk about the least because there is the least to say. You prepare your systems. You monitor your systems. You arrive. The physics are not mysterious to us, not anymore, but they are not comfortable either, and the professional culture of fleet engineering has never been one that emphasizes comfort. You prepare. You monitor. You arrive. We arrived. I felt the resolute margin settle out of transit in the characteristic way. The brief shudder through the hull, the half-second where every display goes gray before snapping back to full readout, the sound the drive makes when it transitions from transit phase to in-system operation, which I can only describe as the ship catching its breath. And then the displays were back and I was reading them, and the readings told me we were in the Surath system, 4.2 astronomical units from Surath Prime, and the fleet was resolving around us, ship after ship after ship dropping out of fold, the formation rebuilding itself in real space with the precision of something that had been rehearsed for 4 days without stopping. I did not go to the observation deck. I stayed in the engineering bay. I did my job. What I know of the next phase I know from briefings, from the bridge communications that filtered down to my station, and from talking afterward to people who were watching from viewports or duty positions that had windows. I will tell you what I know. The Surath Directorate was not unprepared for us. They had defenses, orbital platforms, a home fleet, the standard architecture of an interstellar power that has existed for several centuries and has fought wars before, and expects that its military posture communicates something about the cost of aggression. Their home fleet numbered somewhere between 30 and 40,000 warships by the best intelligence estimates, which meant that when 418,000 fleet hulls resolved in their outer system, the Directorate was looking at roughly a 12-to-1 disadvantage in raw numbers, not accounting for capability differences. They opened a communications channel within 40 minutes of our arrival. I was told about this later. A directorate official, a senior administrator, not a military officer. The directorate did not send a military officer first. They sent an administrator, which tells you everything, came on the channel and explained, in careful and very precise language, that the decree in question was an internal administrative matter and did not constitute an act of aggression under any applicable treaty, that the human settlers in question had failed to register under directorate law and therefore occupied an ambiguous legal status that the decree was simply resolving, and that the directorate was prepared to discuss a framework for formal recognition of the settlers' personhood, contingent on a registration process that would take approximately 18 to 24 months and would include certain obligations. Admiral Moss said, "No." That was his entire response, one word, then he closed the channel. The administrator opened it again. He began again with the framework. He got approximately one sentence in. Moss closed the channel again. The administrator opened it a third time. He said, and I am told this is a precise translation, "We must insist that you recognize the legal basis of the decree under Article 7, subsection 12, and that any further action on your part would constitute a violation of." Moss said, "You filed paperwork on 2.3 million human beings. You called them biological units. You put them on a labor track that runs 40 years. A pause. We are going to show you what we think of your paperwork." He closed the channel and did not open it again. The battle of the Surath outer system lasted 9 hours. I know this from timestamps. I was in the engineering bay for all 9 hours, though the Resolute Margin was not engaged in direct combat for most of them. Her role was support, monitoring the drives of the dreadnought formations she traveled with, keeping their engineering teams in communication, flagging anything that needed immediate attention in the middle of a fight when the people who needed to know were very busy. She took fire 3 times. 2 of them were glancing, the kind of hit that rattles your teeth and spikes your damage control displays, but does not require an emergency response, just assessment and confirmation, and the logging of a hull stress reading that is within acceptable parameters. The 3rd hit was not glancing. The 3rd hit took out our secondary power grid on the port side and started a fire in conduit junction 7 Alpha. I will tell you what it is like to fight a fire on a ship in combat. It is very loud. It is hot in a specific way, not the comfortable heat of machinery in operation, but the greedy, seeking heat of something that wants more than it has. It smells of scorched insulation and hot metal and something sweet and chemical that is the suppression compound activating. And it is very focused. Every other thing, the battle, the fleet, the Surath Directorate and its 9 pages of paperwork and its gold hexagonal seal, recedes to a background frequency. The fire is what is real. The fire is what you are doing. My crew had trained for fires. We had drilled for fires until the drill was boring, until the response sequence was automatic, until each person knew their role so completely that they could execute it half asleep or shaking or both, which is usually what combat looks like. Ajay led the suppression team into Junction 7 Alpha. Engineer Second Class Priya Sandhu rerouted the starboard grid to compensate for the port loss while I stood at the master control panel and directed and monitored and called instructions and watched the damage control displays tell me things were bad and then not as bad and then manageable. 11 minutes. The fire was out in 11 minutes. Ajay had a burn on his left forearm that he would not acknowledge for another 2 hours. Sandhu had done the reroute so cleanly that the dreadnought formation we were supporting never lost our monitoring signal. We were back to full operational status, minus the port secondary grid, which we rerouted around in 24 minutes. I logged it. I marked it for full repair at next dry dock. I went back to my station. The battle ended. The Surath home fleet, what was left of it, which was not much, retreated to defensive orbit around Surath Prime. Fleet Command gave them 6 hours to stand down and permit approach. They did not stand down. Fleet Command then engaged the orbital defense platforms and the remaining fleet elements in a second engagement that lasted 3.5 hours. By the time the ardent reckoning established orbit over Surath Prime, the Surath Directorate had lost the better part of its military capacity. This is a fact I state without apology and without decoration. They had chosen the defense of the decree over the defense of their people, which is itself something you could spend a long time thinking about. That an administration which stripped human beings of personhood to make them labor assets made, when the moment came, precisely the calculation you would expect an administration like that to make. It defended the paperwork. The ground phase took longer. I was part of the ground phase. Not in a combat role. I was not trained for combat, not at the level of the Marine battalions that went down in the first wave. My role in the ground phase was what my role always is: propulsion support, engineering assessment, keeping the equipment that everyone else depends on running in conditions that are not ideal for equipment. But I was on the surface of Surath Prime for 19 days, and I saw what I saw, and I will tell you about it. Surath Prime was a cold world. Not inhospitable. The Surath were not a species that thrived in extremes. They were bureaucrats, not soldiers, and they had built their homeworld's infrastructure for comfort and efficiency. The capital, which the Directorate's administrative records designated as Administrative Center 1, but which the Surath themselves called something that translated loosely as the convened place, was a city of broad flat buildings in pale gray stone, organized along a grid that seemed to have been planned to the centimeter, which it probably had. Everything was straight. Everything was labeled. Signs at every intersection, markings on every door, category designations on every structure. The Surath apparently could not move through their own city without being reminded, at regular intervals, of exactly where they were and what each building was for. It was, I thought, a city that had been designed by people who believed very strongly in the importance of categories. The Directorate's central administrative complex was in the middle of Administrative Center 1 at the intersection of the city's 2 main avenues, a cluster of 11 buildings arranged around a central plaza, the buildings taller than anything else in the city, their facades covered in the gold hexagonal pattern I recognized from the letterhead. Each building was labeled: the Registry, the Records Center, the Assessment Bureau, the Decree Office. The Decree Office. I stood in the plaza on the 4th day of the ground phase and looked at the Decree Office for a long time. It was 4 stories tall. Its doors were large and heavy and made of a local stone that had a slight iridescence to it. Functional, the Surath would have said, chosen for durability and resistance to the planet's weather. There was nothing ornate about it except the scale and the precision. It was a building that said, important things happen here, and the things that happen here are permanent, and the permanence is the point. Inside that building, someone had written the words unregistered biological units. Someone had organized the 9 pages. Someone had made the appendices run to 6,000 additional pages, all those names, all those people, categorized and labeled and assigned to a 40-year labor track. Someone had stamped the seal. The Marines had already secured the building. The Directorate's administrators had been evacuated from the complex, evacuated, not harmed. We were not in the business of executing civilians, and the Surath administrative workers who had spent their days in those buildings were, most of them, exactly what they appeared to be. People doing a job in a bureaucratic structure, unquestioning because the structure had never given them reason to question, performing the labor of a system they had been born into and could no more see from outside than a fish can see water. They were not the decree. They were just the people who had written it and stamped it and filed it. They were processed, documented, released to designated civilian zones. What was not released was the infrastructure. This was the part of the ground phase that I participated in directly, and I want to be careful about how I describe it because I think about it still, on certain nights, not with regret exactly, but with a sustained attention that has never quite resolved into anything simpler. What we did to Surath Prime's administrative infrastructure was deliberate and total and surgical. We did not bomb the city. We did not burn the residential areas. We did not harm the Surath population in any way that was not strictly unavoidable in the process of establishing and maintaining ground control. Those were the orders, and the orders were followed, because the fleet is not an instrument of mass punishment, and we are not the kind of people who confuse revenge on an institution with revenge on a species. But the decree office came down, and the registry, and the records center, and the assessment bureau, and every other building in that central complex, dismantled systematically, piece by piece, with the same engineering precision that I apply to a propulsion fault. Identify the component, remove it, ensure the surrounding systems are stabilized, proceed. The Surath's administrative records, centuries of them, the entire paper architecture of the directorates claim to authority over the outer reaches and everyone in them, were extracted, cataloged by our own intelligence teams, and then destroyed. All of it, the physical records, the digital archives, the backup systems in the secondary archive facility 17 kilometers outside the capital, which we found because the administrative workers we had evacuated turned out to be, as a population, not particularly committed to dying for the institution that employed them, and several of them had told us about the secondary facility before anyone had even thought to ask. The gold hexagonal seal was gone. What we left in the place where the central complex had stood was a plaza, cleared ground, not scorched, not cratered, just cleared, swept, the rubble removed and processed. A space that said, this was here and now it is not here, and the fact of its absence is not an accident. In the center of that plaza, we planted a transmitter. The transmitter broadcast on all standard frequencies used by the Surath Directorate's administrative and communications networks. It broadcast continuously. It broadcast a single message, on loop, in Surath Common, which translates into English like this. These 14 worlds are human worlds. The people on them are human citizens. They have always been human citizens. They will always be human citizens. The decree of Cycle 7 has been annulled. The Surath Directorate has been dissolved. Any attempt to reconstitute the Directorate, reassert administrative authority over human settlement worlds, or refile the decree or any equivalent instrument will be treated as a continuation of the original act. The ardent reckoning will respond accordingly. This message will not be repeated. It does not need to be repeated. You heard it. That was the message. 23 days after the decree was filed, that was our answer to the 9 pages and the 6,000 appendices and the gold hexagonal seal. We left the transmitter running. I want to tell you about the day the ground phase ended, because it is the thing I remember most clearly, and I want to be honest about what I remember. It was midday on Surath Prime, their midday, the planet's sun low and cold in the way of high-latitude winter, the light spreading flat across the cleared plaza. My crew had finished the last of our engineering support work, the last of our equipment loaded, the last system check run, the last log entry made. We were waiting for the transport that would take us back up to the Resolute Margin, which was in low orbit with most of the fleet, and I was standing at the edge of the cleared plaza, looking at the transmitter. It was a simple thing. 1.5 meters tall, pale gray casing, nothing remarkable about it except what it was doing. It was broadcasting. It would broadcast for approximately 14 years on its current power cell before it would need maintenance, and by then the situation would either be sufficiently settled that it could be quietly decommissioned, or it would need to be replaced, which we would arrange. A Jay came to stand beside me. His burn was bandaged. He had been quiet for most of the ground phase, focused, precise, doing his job with the particular attention of someone who is using the work to hold something else in place. He said, "Did you hear about Ember?" I said I had heard. The fleet elements sent to begin the restoration process on the Bren Archipelago's 17 moons had arrived the previous day. The labor integration on Ember had not progressed as far as on some of the other worlds. It had been 18 days since the decree, not long enough for the Directorate's machinery to have done what it was trying to do. The people on Ember had been moved to holding facilities, their homes and tools and equipment inventoried and seized for integration into the Directorate's labor system. But they were alive and unharmed, and the fleet had opened the facilities and documented the conditions, and was in the process of returning what could be returned. His cousin Ya and her daughters were among the people from Ember. He stood there for a moment, then he said, "She asked someone what happened, they told her. She said," he stopped. I waited. He said, "She said she didn't believe it. She said she thought they were lying, that it was too big to be real. She thought maybe it was a Directorate trick, someone telling them a story so they'd come out of the facilities without causing trouble." I said, "What changed her mind?" He said, "She saw the ships." I thought about that. 418,000 ships. The ardent reckoning in orbit over Surath Prime, while its sister elements spread through 14 star systems, undoing 19 days of paperwork, and somewhere in the Bren Archipelago, on a moon called Ember, a woman standing outside a holding facility looking up at a sky full of fleet hulls and understanding slowly that the thing she had thought was too big to be real was real. I said, "Good." Ajay nodded. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. The transport came. We loaded our equipment and our crew, and we rose through the cold, thin atmosphere of Surath Prime, and we rejoined the resolute margin. And I went back to my engineering bay and ran the post-ground phase systems check, which found 3 new items requiring attention that had accumulated during the 19 days, and I began addressing them in order of priority. I want to tell you something about the Surath Directorate, because I think it matters. They were not, as alien civilizations go, a particularly unusual kind of wrong. The specific wrongness of what they did, the reclassification, the 9 pages, the labor track, was not unique in its structure. Civilizations that have existed long enough and grown bureaucratic enough sometimes produce this particular kind of evil. The evil that is dressed in procedure, that hides its nature in the language of administration, that does what it does not in anger or cruelty or even explicit malice, but in the tone of someone organizing a filing cabinet. This is, in many ways, the worst kind of evil, not because it is the most violent, it is usually not, but because it is the kind that believes in itself. The Surath administrator who opened the communications channel and began explaining Article 7, Subsection 12 was not lying. He genuinely believed that what the decree had done was a legal act, a legitimate administrative action, a clarification of an ambiguous status. He had probably spent his entire career filing documents in that building with the iridescent doors, and every document had been legitimate, and so this one was too. The abstraction is the mechanism. You call a person a biological unit, and you have solved the problem that would otherwise prevent you from doing what you want to do with them. You put it in 9 pages with a gold hexagonal seal, and you have solved the problem that would otherwise make you feel the weight of what you are doing. The paperwork is not incidental to the evil. The paperwork is how the evil functions. We took the paperwork away. All of it, every record, every archive, every backup, every copy. The entire legislative and administrative history of the Surath Directorates claim to authority over the outer reaches. Centuries of accumulated procedure and precedent and category, reduced to data files in fleet intelligence archives, and rubble in a cleared plaza, and a transmitter broadcasting on loop. I am not a philosopher. I am an engineer. I do not spend much time thinking about the moral architecture of what we do. I spend most of my time thinking about propulsion systems and heat tolerances, and the specific sound a coupling mount makes when it is about to fail. But I have thought about this in the years since, and what I think is this. They believed that categories could make people into not people. They believed that if you filed the right paperwork with the right seal, you could dissolve a human being's personhood the way you dissolve a corporate entity, administratively, cleanly, without remainder. They believed that what makes a person is whether someone has written it down in the right place, in the right format, with the right authorization. We showed them what we believed. We believe that what makes a person is not the paperwork. It has never been the paperwork. The paperwork can burn and the categories can be dissolved and the seal can be ground to gravel, and the building that housed the decree can be cleared to bare stone, and the 2.3 million people on those 14 worlds remain exactly what they were before the Surath Directorate opened its filing system and found them inadequately categorized. They remain human beings. They remain citizens. They remain ours. The Directorate is gone. The 14 worlds are still here. The people on them are still here. That is the answer to the 9 pages. It is not a complicated answer. We did not need 9 pages for it. I want to tell you about something that happened 6 months after we came home, because I think it belongs here even though it is small and quiet, and not the kind of thing that appears in fleet action reports. I was back at Crest Station, back on the Resolute margin, back in the engineering bay. We had gone through the full post-campaign refit, the port's secondary grid rebuilt, the Junction 7 Alpha conduit work completed properly, the various items that had accumulated during 19 days on a hostile surface addressed in full. The Resolute margin was, if anything, in better shape than she had been before the ardent reckoning departed. She had been worked on by people who were working with purpose, and purpose does something to the quality of your work that I cannot fully explain, but that I recognize. I was calibrating the port thrust manifold, the same general type of work, the kind of deep-in-the-ship work that is my natural element, when a J appeared at the bottom of the access shaft. He held up his data tablet. He said, "Thought you'd want to see this." I climbed out. I looked at the tablet. It was a photograph, not a professional image, not something from a fleet communication, a personal photograph, the kind you take with a personal device, slightly crooked and slightly overexposed, the way personal photographs always are. It showed a stretch of shallow water with morning light on it, the water slightly amber-colored from whatever mineral content the moon seas had. In the shallows, someone had built something, a small structure, maybe half a meter tall, assembled from what looked like local flat stones stacked with careful precision. A cairn. Not elaborate, not large. Just a deliberate stack of stones in a specific place, obviously intentional, obviously made by human hands. At the base of the cairn, on a flat stone laid as a kind of plinth, someone had written something in a language I did not speak. But below it, in a different hand, someone had added a translation in English. It said, "We were here before the decree. We are here after. We will be here when the transmitter is old." I looked at the photograph for a long time. A J said, "Ya sent it." She said they built it the first morning after our ships came. She said the whole settlement came out to the shore and they built it together. I gave the tablet back to him. I went back into the access shaft. I went back to the port thrust manifold. I went back to work. There is a tendency when telling stories about what the fleet does to make it about the fleet. The numbers 418,000 ships, 2.3 million people, 9 pages, 22 days are important, and I have given them to you because they are true and because precision matters. The scale matters. The response has to be at a scale that answers the act, not just rhetorically but in terms of what it communicates to every other power watching. You do not send a task force to answer a decree that stripped 2.3 million people of their legal personhood. You send everything. You send the ardent reckoning. You make the answer as large as the insult, and then larger, and then you make it permanent. That part matters. I am not diminishing it. The numbers matter. But the photograph is also true. The cairn in the shallow amber water on a moon called Ember in the early morning light, built by 12,000 people the morning after the ships came. The translation in the second hand. We were here before the decree. We are here after. We will be here when the transmitter is old. Both things are the answer. The 418,000 warships and the cairn in the water. The transmitter on loop in the cleared plaza, and the photograph on a Jay's tablet. The ardent reckoning dismantling a building with iridescent doors, and a woman named Ya standing in shallow water with her daughters, stacking flat stones in the early morning. The Surath Directorate believed that the document was more real than the person. They had built their entire civilization on that belief. Centuries of filing and categorizing and assigning and tracking. An elaborate machine for turning living things into administrative units, and administrative units into labor assets, and labor assets into wealth, and wealth back into more machinery for the same process. They believed that if you controlled the categories, you controlled the reality. We took their categories. We gave them ours. Our category is simple. It does not require 9 pages. It does not require a gold hexagonal seal. It does not require a building with iridescent doors or 6,000 pages of appendices or a 40-year labor track. Our category is this. A human being is a human being, wherever they are, however they got there, whether they are registered or unregistered, documented or undocumented, recognized by whatever administrative framework happens to claim authority over the space they occupy. A human being is a human being. And if you file paperwork that says otherwise, if you stamp it with your seal and send it through your proper administrative channels and call it a clarification, we will come, not to negotiate, not to discuss the legal basis of your decree, not to request a suspension pending a review process. We will come with 418,000 ships, and we will take your decree apart, page by page, seal by seal, building by building, archive by archive, until what remains of your administrative claim to authority over our people is a cleared plaza and a transmitter on loop in the language you thought you were going to use to run our lives. We will not leave a note explaining our position. Our position arrived in 418,000 ships. It is still broadcasting. I retired from the fleet 7 years after the ardent reckoning came home. I have a position now at a propulsion research institute on Earth, which is quieter work and work I like, and I am not going to pretend that some part of me does not miss the resolute margin, the weight of her under my feet, the sound the port ventral stabilizer made, the particular quality of recycled air in the engineering bay at 300 when the bay was quiet, and I was the only one awake, and the ship was breathing around me. But the work I do now is not nothing. The engines that the fleet's next generation of support cruisers will carry, that work begins here, in rooms with good lighting and stable air, and no one shooting at us. It begins with people like me who understand what the engines need to do, and what it costs when they fail, and what it means to have reliable propulsion on a ship that is going somewhere important. We are always going somewhere important. There have been no further erasure decrees, not from the successor administrations that emerged in the Surath system after the Directorate's dissolution, modest structures, appropriately modest, careful in their language about what they claim authority over, not from any other power with an interest in the outer settlement band. The 14 worlds have grown. The Yun Cooperative has completed the terraforming of a second ocean continent. The Bren Archipelago's moon called Ember has expanded its sea harvest operation and now ships ore and minerals, and a particular dried food product, I am told, is considered a delicacy in several systems. Ajay's cousin Ya runs the settlement's administrative council, which is a different kind of administrative council from the Surath Directorate's administrative council, And not only because her counsel does not strip anyone of legal personhood. The cairn is still there. I know because Ajay sends me the photographs when Ya sends them to him, which she does every year around the anniversary of the morning they built it. The cairn has grown. People add stones. It is taller now than it was in the first photograph, and the stone plinth at the base has been replaced with a proper flat slab, and the inscription has been recut in deeper letters. We were here before the decree. We are here after. We will be here when the transmitter is old. The transmitter is not old yet. It is still broadcasting.